Ladies and gentlemen, this is UX and this is the sanction-fueled destruction of the Russian aviation industry by the channel Wendover Production. Yes, this is the latest video by Wendover. I guess it was just uploaded a few hours ago. I think I remember reacting to one or two Wendover videos. They are really interesting, right? It's more like a somewhat of a real life lore, but I guess history field or something like that. Right, fun facts but about history or something, if I remember correctly. I don't know, but yeah, someone told me I should do this. This is oh, holy shit, it has 500,000 views already. All right, let's do this one.
In a matter of 3 weeks, the Russian aviation industry slid back 3 decades. With one rambling justification and a subsequent brazen invasion came a cascading series of implications that brought the golden era of global aviation cooperation to a
I'm such a moron. Of course, it's about current events, right? I don't know why I didn't thought of that. Maybe I'm used to reacting to historical videos so much like, which time is it? Oh, okay, the talk is about right now. All the things that are happening right now, that is creating destruction in Russian aviation industry, I guess.
A screeching halt. As a 21st century Iron Curtain fell across Eastern Europe, Russian commercial aviation began reverting to a bygone era. An era marked by tension, by distrust bordering on paranoia, and by extreme and utter isolation. Throughout the Soviet era, the nation's aviation industry was defined by stark insularity. While air traffic controllers and pilots around the world spoke English, those in the USSR spoke Russian. While Western countries benefited from innovation born out of competition between private aerospace companies, technological advances in the USSR fell entirely on the state. Soviet planes, like the Tupolev 104, equivalent to the de Havilland Comet, and the Tupolev 154, equivalent to the Boeing 707, were the intellectual output of a centrally planned OKB, or an experimental design bureau, while their construction, maintenance, regulation, and certification all fell under the purview of the centralized Ministry of Aviation Industry. While much of the rest of the world's aviation industry coalesced around a sprawling set of standards, a host of trusted aerospace companies and carriers, and a spattering of supranational organizations like the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Soviet Union turned inward. Domestic flights dominated Soviet commercial aviation. Flights from Soviet capitals, regional hubs, and vacation spots composed much of state-run Aeroflot's routes. Across the post-Stalin era, Russians traveled increasingly by air for business and pleasure, but rarely did they leave the confines of the USSR. Though Aeroflot at its height serviced over 100 countries, only select Soviets, diplomats, athletes, scientists, and artists, saw the outside world with any regularity. For the business traveler, international trips hinged on their ability to prove the travel was absolutely necessary and the ability to pass extensive background.
Yeah, but around this time it was more like when NATO was created in the first place. So NATO countries, Russian, basically Soviet countries at that time. It was time for Soviet Union. So outside countries were not much of friendly neighbor country type of mentality. So this was around the Cold War time, I guess. So in that, obviously the inner flights are going to dominate, and flight going outside is not going to be much, right? Because of this conflict, right? Even the conflict of ideas, right? State-run industry compared to the privatized industry, obviously communism versus
Background checks. For the average Moscow resident with a hint of wanderlust, well, there was Sochi, or Odessa, or Dombay. Of course, strict rules over what went out also informed what went in. Inbound international flights, when allowed, were bound to specific, sometimes suspiciously circuitous routings. Incoming visitors were given strict travel itineraries, and closed airspace was closely monitored. In the case of Korean Airlines Flight 7, to tragic consequences. Closed airspace built walls in the sky. Walls which created a world of separated worlds. One where cities like Anchorage became international hubs. One where the Soviet aviation industry and Soviet travelers existed separate from the rest. One that current events have us poised to return to. Just hours after Russian missiles began tearing across Ukrainian skies, it became apparent that it wouldn't only be Ukrainian airspace taking on a new atmosphere of hostility. The same day the invasion began, the UK Department for Transport banned all civilian Russian aircraft from its airspace. Direct Aeroflot flights from Moscow to Heathrow would be no more. If Western powers weren't going to directly intervene, they'd lay sanctions. And as during the Cold War, Western powers again identified commercial aviation as a means of inflicting economic pain on the aggressor. In the following days, the European Union, Canada, then the United States, among others, banned Russian flights from their airspace. Russia, for its part, responded in kind, closing its airspace to the 30-plus unfriendly countries.
I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, what is other thing besides goods, transport of goods that you can ban? It's people, right? So ban Russian people from traveling anywhere. That's a kind of a hard, hitting blow, I guess.
A tit-for-tat move. Walls went up, and an era of unprecedented peacetime mobility slammed shut. Aeroflot, which just days before had operated international flights as far east as Tokyo and as far west as Los Angeles, announced on March 5th that its only international service would be into the capital city of Minsk in allied Belarus. European and American carriers began diverting routes so as to avoid Russian airspace. Russian airspace that US airlines typically crossed an average of 1,400 times a week. Flights like Lufthansa's LH716 from Frankfurt to Tokyo once arched over Siberia, but now cut south through Central Asia. In the most indicative example of the rapid backslide into Soviet-era aviation norms, Finnair announced it was dusting the cobwebs off the circuitous route from Helsinki to Tokyo, one last flown in the late 80s, adding more than 3 hours of flight time, but avoiding Russia entirely. When, if ever, these walls go down is anyone's guess. What is certain, though, is that redirected flight patterns and a return to an almost exclusively domestic route network marks only the tip of the iceberg as to the long-term impact of Russia's invasion on Russian aviation. Beyond the growing divide between Russia and—
Listen, man, holy shit. I mean, basically, whenever some company thrives at an international level, right, like, aviation industry, and then it plummets like that for God knows how long, will it be able to recover? Like, that's a major blow for, future history, right? So, yeah, I guess this video is interesting. I like how, the war elements are going around, and Wendover's like, okay, let's talk about the aviation industry.
Global skies, the country's aviation industry is also experiencing a new digital divide. You see, whether it be a hotel in Zanzibar, a rental car company in Jeju, or a regional airline in Guatemala, the entire world of travel is all connected by the Global Distribution System, the GDS. At the simplest level, the GDS is a common, connected way to communicate and book inventory between travel providers. This and other back-end communication is crucial for airlines in particular, since they rely so heavily on bookings originating from third-party online travel agencies like Google Flights, Expedia, or Skyscanner, and also on selling tickets that include flights operated by other airlines. When a passenger flies Delta from Seattle to Amsterdam, then connects on KLM to Athens, Delta and KLM systems need to communicate. If they didn't, the passenger wouldn't be able to get their KLM boarding pass when checking in Seattle, they wouldn't be able to check their bag all the way through to Athens, they wouldn't be able to get help from KLM if a Delta delay led to a misconnection. Back-end communication is crucial for the cohesive travel experience from airline to airline. Now, GDS software is essentially run by 3 companies: Amadeus, Sabre, and Travelport. Combined, they hold the market outright. Therefore, the announcement that all 3 GDS providers were suspending Aeroflot's access was considered a death blow for the airline. This decision was guided by the fact that Aeroflot is a majority state-owned airline, and so Aeroflot revenue would go directly to the very entity funding the deadly invasion of Ukraine. Now, without access to the GDS, Aeroflot flights no longer appear on Google Flights, Expedia, Skyscanner, or any other online travel agency. To book, one must go directly to Aeroflot's website. In addition, and perhaps more crucially, Aeroflot flights can no longer be booked as part of itineraries with other airlines. While most international airlines have suspended service to Russia, Middle Eastern carriers, namely Turkish, Qatar, Etihad, and Emirates, have emerged as a crucial air bridge for the country, one of the few convenient ways in or out, especially when heading to Western destinations. Etihad, in particular, used to code-share with Aeroflot, allowing a passenger to book a ticket from Abu Dhabi to Moscow, then seamlessly connect onwards on Aeroflot to Sochi, for example. Without GDS, this is no longer possible. Therefore, there's no easy way to travel from outside of Russia to anywhere beyond the destinations of those few inbound international flights, essentially anywhere but Moscow. While privately owned airlines in Russia have yet to be removed from the GDS, all restrictions combined mean that Russia's relative distance to the world has now dramatically increased. Traveling from London to Murmansk, for example, used to be thoroughly simple. A 3-hour Aeroflot flight from Heathrow to Moscow, a 1-hour connection, then a 2-hour flight north to the Arctic city. Now, however, the most efficient way of that journey is likely a full 10-hour travel day on Turkish Airlines from London to Istanbul to Moscow, an overnight at an airport hotel, then a morning flight the next day on Aeroflot to finally arrive in Murmansk. That's to say, the fastest way to get between two cities a mere 1,600 miles or 2,600 kilometers apart now takes longer than flying from London to Sydney. But even for those flights that can operate for those passengers who are able to book, there's an open question as to whether there's going to be the aircraft to fly them. You see, while many might perceive aircraft as a product, as something sold from manufacturer to airline, increasingly, they're a service. A majority of the world's commercial aircraft fleet is now made up of leased aircraft, those owned by an outside company but rented to airlines for a term of a few years.
Okay.
Rather than getting on a years-long waiting list to spend a huge amount of working capital on a single aircraft, airlines have come to enjoy the flexibility of shorter-term lease agreements. It allows them to grow and shrink their fleets more easily in response to shifts in demand and pay for aircraft as revenue comes in rather than before. Of Russia's 980 passenger aircraft, 777 are leased. Of those,
What?
two-thirds, or 515, are leased from companies based outside of the country. Nearly all of those foreign companies are now either required to terminate their lease agreements due to sanctions imposed by their home country, or have chosen to due to a lack of faith in Russian Airlines' ability to continue paying due to the collapse of the ruble and the
Oh my god, what the fuck? I never thought of it like that. So most of the flights are leased one by the certain company. Obviously that's the most efficient way of doing it. Like, why would you spend way too much capital just buying planes when you can lease it, right? I mean, you are providing a kind of service, right? So by demands you can decide if you want to lease more or less or whatever. But now this creates a dilemma that half of the planes at least are gonna, pull back because they are internationally owned planes.
decimation of international route networks. Now, as aircraft leasing gained prominence in the early 2000s, a number of nations came together to sign the Cape Town Treaty. Like ships, for example, aircraft often spend much or most of their service lives outside of the country in which they're registered, so an Irish leasing company like AerCap, for example, can't rely on Irish law to give it the right to repossess an aircraft for non-payment if it was leased to a foreign airline and located outside of Ireland. Therefore, the Cape Town Convention made aircraft leases, and especially aircraft repossessions, enforceable by international law. It meant that AerCap had a legal right to ask the Russian authorities to help it seize an Aeroflot aircraft for non-payment or lease termination. That's, of course, because Russia is a signatory of the Cape Town Treaty. However, in this case, facing the loss of the majority of its civil aviation fleet, the nation just decided to ignore it. In fact, not only did they ignore it, but instead, Russia began a state-sanctioned theft of billions upon billions of dollars worth of aircraft.
Alright. This is fucking awesome. Yeah, so obviously, if someone can invade a country when there's a major no-no violating many laws, international laws and God's what, he's not going to be like, okay, you can't have the plane, give me back those planes. He's just going to, no. What, you going to do, invade me and take my planes? Go, good luck with that shit. So it's just, they're just going to refuse to give planes back.
See, the majority of the aircraft owned by major international leasing companies are registered in either Ireland or Bermuda, mostly due to tax advantages. Therefore, when those two countries revoked the certificates of airworthiness for aircraft logged on their registries but leased to Russian airlines, that meant that nearly all of those 515 aircraft were no longer legally able to fly and that the lessors wanted them back. However, in response, Putin signed a law allowing Russia's airlines to re-register these aircraft as Russian as if they were their own property. Essentially, Russia is telling its airlines to just keep the planes. As long as they don't leave the country, they'll stay in their hands. That means going forward, these aircraft will likely only operate domestic routes, while fully owned or Russian-leased aircraft will operate any international routes. However, even that could become difficult. To retain their legal and practical ability to fly, aircraft are continuously subjugated to an extensive maintenance and inspection schedule. But now, both Boeing and Airbus have suspended all maintenance support to Russian airlines, leaving them few options for sourcing legitimate parts. Without legitimate parts, even legitimately owned aircraft could lose the right to fly internationally. And then on top of that—
Oh no, here we go, right? Here we go, like 70s, 80s thing about, taped together planes and shit in 21st century.
that, even the Russian-made Sukhoi Superjet, the most common domestic-made aircraft, faces maintenance issues too, as its official part supplier is Lufthansa Technik, which is based in Germany, a country that has enacted sanctions preventing the company from supplying parts to Russian airlines. Now, there is precedent for this situation. Iran's aviation industry operated under similarly severe sanctions from 2007 to 2015. This resulted in them holding on to the aircraft they had prior to the sanctions long past their typical service lives. When an aircraft part went faulty, focus was placed on repairing it rather than replacing it, since nearly all parts replacement required cannibalizing from grounded aircraft. As time went on, more and more aircraft had to be grounded to supply parts to the flying ones, and the country's skies became some of the most dangerous in the world as safety standards grew increasingly relaxed. Russia is likely to operate under a similar system. Assuming it continues to hold on to all 980 of its commercial aircraft, it'll have an oversupply due to its airlines' inability to operate most in-demand international routes. But the longer the sanctions stretch on, the more planes will have to be dedicated to cannibalization, and the fewer there will be that can actually fly.
That's just effed
Beyond
up,
the
man.
obvious, the absolute destruction of the progress Russian airlines have made over the past 3 decades, building themselves up into legitimate, safe, respected global carriers, the near total disconnection between the Russian and global aviation industries could actually accelerate progress for certain others. To start, between Sukhoi and Irkut, Russia has been attempting to revitalize its storied aircraft manufacturing industry. So far with little success, as their aircraft have not been competitive with those of Western manufacturers. However, without the competition, these domestic manufacturers will become one of the only sources for new aircraft. This could also have a spillover effect for China, as their state-owned aircraft manufacturer Comac is nearing first deliveries of its C919 aircraft, roughly equivalent to an A320 or 737. If it's able to make a version free of parts from countries that have sanctioned Russia or China, which is a big if, Comac could capture demand from Russia that could not be fulfilled by Comac's primary competitors, Boeing and Airbus.
Yeah.
But the implications go further than that. While the impact of Russia's airspace closure was dulled by weak international travel demand to and from Asia, with most of the continent's borders still closed in response to the pandemic, as this demand grows in step with COVID's fade, this could have broad, long-term implications on the global aviation industry. Finnair, based in Helsinki for example, has long taken advantage of their position in the northeast of Europe, on the direct path between most major European and Asian cities, to offer some of the quickest connecting itineraries between the two continents. In fact, prior to the pandemic, they were the only major European airline which flew the majority of their long-haul routes to Asia rather than North America or elsewhere. However, when Asian travel demand's return started to lag behind the rest of the world's, Finnair announced that it would begin flying long-haul routes to destinations in the US and Thailand from Stockholm, a new secondary hub to complement its primary one in Helsinki. In retrospect, that seems an extremely prudent move, and it's likely the airline will continue on a similar strategic path, reallocating its resources westward in response to its quick flip from best to worst positioned for Europe to Asia flying. But as one airport falls, another rises. Elsewhere in the northern latitudes, Anchorage Airport might regain its strategic status for Europe to Asia flying. During the Cold War, Anchorage was home to one of the most cosmopolitan airports in the world, as European and Asian airlines used it as a refueling stop, avoiding Soviet airspace. Routing a flight from Tokyo to London via Anchorage does add about 4 hours to flight time, but it is essentially the fastest route when overflying Russia isn't an option.
I mean, yeah, obviously that makes sense. One man's loss is another man's gain, right? So that's going to be the case here. Many of the different airports and things are probably going to get screwed over, while other ones are going to benefit from this. But yeah, holy shit, sanctions basically has long effect that's going to be felt for years and years, even after everything's over. This is just fucked up. We are living in a time that's just going to have long lasting effect even after 1 or 2 decades, right? Like right now, this 2022, this what we're living. Yeah, this is going to be a moment for the history that people are going to remember 2022. Like, goddamn.
In fact, Japan Airlines flights on that route have already started flying over Anchorage, although without stopping for fuel, since aircraft now have longer ranges than in decades past. However, the more fuel you add to an aircraft, the heavier it is, and therefore the more fuel you have to use to carry the added fuel weight. Essentially, as flight distance increases, average fuel burn per mile.
I think a real life lore made that video, right? Like with that ratio, the more you can just put infinite amount of fuel, right? So just the right amount of fuel before it becoming too much and becoming a waste. What is the longest flight you can take or something like that? I'm pretty sure real life lore made of that video.
Increases. Of course, packages, unlike passengers, don't care about stops, so cargo airlines have long used Anchorage as a refueling hub on flights between North America and Asia. Now, however, it's become advantageous to use Anchorage as a stop on their flights between Asia and Europe as well. Nippon Cargo Airlines' route from Tokyo to Amsterdam used to fly non-stop in a quick 11.5 hours, but the closure of Russian airspace has now made that entirely infeasible. Instead, it flies northeast for 6.5 hours towards Anchorage, stops for refueling, then continues 9 hours onward to Amsterdam. Compared to before, this requires 4 hours of additional flight time, but it's certainly better than the alternative. FedEx's route from Osaka to Paris, for example, normally flying a similar distance between similarly located cities, now flies 11.5 hours first to Dubai, then 7.5 to Paris. 19 hours of flying for a route that previously took less than 12. If these airspace closures prolong, the airline might opt to route the flight through Anchorage, an itinerary that could save them 2 hours over Dubai. FedEx and UPS already have major operations at Anchorage, so it's very possible they'll start to expand the model that's worked for Asia to North America flying to Europe as well in this new reality. Passenger airlines, however, are likely to take advantage of modern aircraft's incredible range to continue to run flights to Asia nonstop, even if they physically route over Alaska. However, one startup airline is likely quietly celebrating the new inaccessibility of Russian skies.
Yeah.
Northern Pacific Airways has announced its intention to start flights from Anchorage to both North America and Asia in 2022, with the goal of creating a connecting hub for trans-Pacific travel. Essentially, they want to become the Icelandair of the Pacific. This startup does, however, face an uphill battle. Transatlantic fares are some of the highest-priced long-haul flights out there on a per-mile basis, despite strong competition. The market can sustain it since it's connecting one wealthy area to another. Trans-Pacific fares, meanwhile, are some of the least expensive on a per-mile basis, thanks to fierce competition from Asian airlines that enjoy low operating costs and strong state support. Therefore, Northern Pacific Airways is unlikely to be able to offer as strong a cost advantage relative to the market as Icelandair. However, especially for itineraries from the eastern half of North America or to the western parts of Asia, Anchorage has gone from a detour to directly on the route.
Yeah.
Delta's flight from Detroit to Seoul, for example, used to take a 13-hour path overflying Russia, but is now having to route via a more southern 14-hour path.
Yeah, basically Russia's so big. All the rerouted routes now are gonna benefit some hubs like Anchorage, right? Alaska, which was the case with the time of Soviet Union. Damn, so this topic is really interesting, right? I mean, look at that. I mean, there is no video. I'll come across lots of this current crisis video, but it's about the crisis and what's going on, right? I've never come across any video that talks about how certain sanction is going to affect certain, industry in this kind of way. This video is really unique.
Overflying Anchorage. A passenger originating in Boston flying via Detroit to Seoul on this flight now has a roughly 19-hour itinerary. Northern Pacific, with 8 hours from Boston to Anchorage, an hour for a connection, then 9 hours onward to Seoul, will now be able to beat Delta by an hour. And even better, by operating 2 medium-length flights rather than one long and one short flight, their fuel burn per passenger will likely be lower, meaning they might be able to offer lower fares. Not only that, but they could now potentially expand their business model to Europe as well. A flight from Anchorage to London, Amsterdam, or Paris only takes 9 hours, so coupled with a 6.5-hour flight from Tokyo to Anchorage, the 17.5-hour total itinerary would only be 2 hours longer than the new circuitous non-stops from Western Europe to Asia, and would likely sell at a much lower cost. In comparison to an itinerary connecting from Paris to London to Tokyo, Northern Pacific's itinerary would likely be faster. Now, a European expansion for this as-yet unlaunched airline is unlikely in the near term, as their fleet will initially be composed of 757s that cannot confidently reach the major European airports, but if this new reality entrenches into the long term, it's certainly an option. At the very least, though, this has raised the business model's status from one met with resounding skepticism among experts to one now considered potentially feasible. Now, the short of all these compounding implications is that, across the board really, from Western travelers to all strata of Russian society, these changes are going to hurt. The decisions of a few and the world's response to those decisions have ensured we'll all feel the squeeze of closed airspace and aviation sanctions. Beyond the economics, though, February 24th, 2022 marks the end of a period of mostly sustained, mostly stable peace between world powers that allowed for unprecedented efficiency and standardization in the skies and unmatched mobility and convenience for the traveler. The 3 decades of uniquely open and accessible airways.
Yeah, I mean, small events, small company events sent ripple through that basically stock market that hurt economies. This, what's happening right now, no shit, it's going to hurt literally everyone around the world, right? I mean, most of the countries around the world, right? I know there are certain individuals and certain individual companies that are going to profit a lot, but mostly all people are going to hurt, right? With the oil prices, even the, now in the aviation, damn, the ripple effect is going to be ridiculous. I remember, talking about just a year or two ago in certain historical videos, right? That we live in a society right now that is like, tethered with everyone, right? And even small events creates a ripple that you can physically see, right? With the hike of prices here and there. So a war would basically screw everything up at a level. They could even start a butterfly effect. That's just going to hurt economy for even decades. I hope this is not that event. Otherwise, we are seriously fucked because we just, went through the 2020 thing, right? And it's still kind of going on. It's still not going away. And now this.
Are over. When, or more accurately, if we're to return to such a time, at this point, is anyone's guess. If you're anything like me, you typically struggle to decide what to do at dinner time. Should I have unhealthy freezer food, expensive takeout, or a time-consuming home-cooked meal? Of course, I no longer have to make this decision since, for the past 2 years, I've used HelloFresh.
Yeah, people, go to the original video page, link from the description, and support this channel with HelloFresh, I guess. Yeah, this was a really interesting and unique topic regarding the current events, like how it's going to hurt aviation industry all around, right? How flights are going to be longer, how certain hubs are going to get restarted. Yeah, that is very interesting. This is just one portion, like one aviation industry. This is just one thing, aviation. And this is the effect. There are way too many different areas that are going to get affected overall, right? So yeah, this is just weird. God knows what kind of a major effect this event is going to, create. And I can tell you that for damn sure, most people will not realize it until it's literally on their face. Like, okay, here's the fucking recession. Here's everything too costly, right? We are all screwed. Nobody's going to realize how it's affecting everybody until that point, right? Until everything is just to their face, nobody's going to see that coming. But yeah. Right, well, that was the sanction-fueled destruction of the Russian aviation industry by the channel Wendover production. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment down if you want to react to a specific video. And yeah, I'll see you next time.